In a moment, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to be brief because I know we've got a lot of really important conversations to have tonight. My name is Rabbi Marc Katz. I'm the rabbi here at Temple Ner Tamid, and it's my pleasure to be able to host tonight's conversation, which is a really important conversation to be having. Now, the why of this conversation will come about as part of the panel, but what I can say is a few things. The first is that we're blessed to have such a distinguished panel. On the panel tonight, it will be Sundeep Iyer, the director of the Civil Rights Division, Michael Campion, chief of the USAO Civil Rights Division, Brandi Katz Rubin from the ADL, and our moderator tonight will be Emily Goldberg, the Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Civil Rights Division. We're also blessed to be joined by our Attorney General, Matthew Platkin, and our U.S. Attorney, Philip Selinger, who you're going to hear both from at the beginning, just welcoming you. In addition, I know that we've got a number of people here from local school districts. If that's you, I know we've got superintendents, we've got others. Just stand up and wave so that we can recognize you and say thank you for being here. And so I want to just say a word before we begin, which is that tonight is about tool building. Not only are we going to hear about what has happened in the schools over the course of the past number of months and years and the rise of anti-Semitism and what we can do about it, but I also know that some of the tools that we're going to learn here are useful not just when it deals with anti-Semitism, but when it deals with any kind of incidents in schools. And what we are finding, and I've been very clear about this in the past, is that the rise in anti-Semitism is not alone in the rise in other kinds of hate that is happening around the world, and especially in our backyard. Islamophobia, anti-LGBTQ, racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Asian hate, all of that is part and parcel of a world that is quickly becoming more and more intolerant. And so tonight, although the focus is going to primarily be on anti-Semitism, you're going to learn tools that I think are applicable to any host of other things that are going on, so that should you see anything that bothers you, or should a friend come to you saying that something has happened in the schools, you're going to have the tools to be able to help them. So without further ado, I want to invite up whoever really wants to go first. I'll invite up our member of our congregation, but also our Attorney General, Matt Platkin, to say a few words.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's really, I am a member here, so I have to say, Rabbi, when to speak in your own temple in front of your rabbi, it's a little intimidating. You know, it's not supposed to go this way. It's supposed to be the other way around. But I am really honored to be here. We have a really tremendous panel that you're going to hear from truly some of the best experts we have in the state. And I think, frankly, we're combating bias in a more comprehensive way than any other state in the country. So I would argue that these folks do this job as well, if not better, than anybody in the country. So you're going to hear from some true experts. And I'm going to be brief because I want you to hear from them. And I want to just first thank my partner in this effort, U.S. Attorney Philip Selinger and his office, Mike and Emily and everybody there. We have a very tight-knit working relationship in this state across federal and state and local partnerships. And unfortunately, we learned that firsthand, how important that was in this synagogue a little under a year ago, when late in one evening, early in one morning, somebody walked up and attempted to throw a Molotov cocktail through the front door of this beautiful sanctuary. And you know, I think it shocked a lot of people in this community that something could rise to that level here. And it brought out, I think, truly the best of this community. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people showed up here, and support came from across the state, diversity of support, an overwhelming amount of support. But it showed, I think, that these types of incidents can occur in any corner of our society, even in places like Bloomfield, Montclair, Glen Ridge, where I think we pride ourselves on being diverse, I hate to say tolerant because I think tolerance is a terrible way to describe it. I think welcoming is a better approach. That's why I moved here. I'm sure that's why so many of you moved here. And unfortunately, ground zero for so much of this activity is in our schools, our K through 12 schools, and it's not necessarily the topic of conversation today, but our college campuses as well. And so the tools that you're going to hear about today in terms of combating this rise in bias and hate are absolutely, as the rabbi said, applicable across the board to every form of bias activity that we're seeing. And we are seeing a rise in bias activity targeting just about every single group you could imagine. If you know a group that doesn't feel like they're feeling an increase or seeing an increase in bias activity, let me know, because I'm not aware of it. But candidly, anti-Semitism has been at a level that I personally never thought I'd see in my lifetime, in this state and across the country. And that was true before October 7th. It is certainly true since October 7th. And it is true especially in our schools and in the online communities. You can hear more about that our students are accessing. And that pains me, having spent a lot of time talking to our kids. It pains me as a chief law enforcement officer, but it also pains me as a father of 2 Jewish kids, as somebody who grew up in public schools in this state. I remember vividly what it feels like. My community did not have a particularly large Jewish population, and I remember what it feels like to be targeted because of my religion and to feel different. And I'm going to embarrass him. My dad's here, and he's volunteering for the ADL, which I'm very proud of. And I remember going into my school. I think I was in 2nd or 3rd grade, and it was around the holidays, and there was no menorah out front. And my dad went to the superintendent or to the school and asked them to put a menorah in front. And I still remember that feeling of walking into school and knowing that I was welcomed in a way that I maybe didn't feel before that symbol. And so some of what we're talking about is how important symbols of welcoming are, and our guidance that we put out through the Department of Education and the Division on Civil Rights talks about that. But there's a number of steps we can take that make kids who feel particularly vulnerable in this moment, who might feel like a space that should be completely safe is not a safe space for them, make them feel like it is. And that's not just something that I feel is like a nice thing to do. It's what the law says we have to do. So that's where my chief law enforcement hat comes back on. And we have been actively engaged with school districts across the state, with college campuses, to make sure that they understand their legal obligations under state and federal law to provide safe environments for kids. And we'll continue to do that. And if anybody feels in school or anywhere else like there is not a safe environment, let us know. And you can go on our website, bias.njcivilrights.gov. You can tell your local police. You can tell, the good news about New Jersey is you can tell pretty much anyone, and it all comes up to us. And we take it extremely seriously, every single one of those reports. I personally review our daily reports of all the complaints made. And we have a team on the civil and criminal side that work on this exclusively. Because when we talk, my department, and I'll finish with this, is the department, I run the Department of Law and Public Safety. So you could think about public safety in a variety of ways. Certainly that means keeping you safe from violent crime, gun violence, or stolen cars, or burglaries, and we're doing that. But to me, public safety has to also mean that you feel safe to go about your lives, however that is you choose to do so, whether it's how you worship, whether it's whom you love, whether it's what color your skin is, what language you speak. All of that is protected under our law. And it's not just enough that we enforce it, it's that you feel like it's safe. And the truth is, going back to where I started, it is very rare that the first instance that somebody engages in biased activity is a violent act. Very rare. Not saying it never happens, but it almost never happens. There's usually something that is a precursor to that. something said, something's written on a wall, a swastika on a playground, an anti-Semitic comment on a social media forum. Something is going to make, it was said or done that made somebody feel uncomfortable. And when it's reported, we can respond to it. Even if it's not a crime or a civil enforcement action, it helps inform us that something's going on. When we see there's a number of reports coming from a particular school district, well, we might know that there's something going on there and we need to figure out how we can intervene before that incident that may seem small to some people. And I've heard this from too many people. Oh, we just thought that, you wouldn't care about that. Before that relatively small incident becomes a real tragedy. So you're going to hear about that tonight, but I encourage you all to engage with us, to share what you're seeing, and to let us know how we can do better to help you be safe, but most importantly, help you feel safe in this very challenging time. So thank you all, and I will turn the mic back over to Rabbi Katz.
And it's my pleasure to call up our U.S. Attorney, Philip Sellinger.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me here today. Thank you, Brandi, Rubin, Rabbi Katz, and all of you for coming. We at the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice are deeply alarmed by the rise in the number of anti-Semitic incidents. And this did not begin on October 7th. For a number of years, we had seen increases in the number of incidents. And this is not just the Jewish community, it's also the Muslim community. And it's understandable that members of both the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and other marginalized communities in New Jersey and across the country feel threatened and unsafe today. And one of the points I'd like to communicate to you is that our mission, our primary focus at the U.S. Attorney's Office is to ensure that the residents of New Jersey are safe. That was part of the founding mission when the department was created in the wake of the Civil War in the 1870s, after Reconstruction, when the KKK was terrorizing the South. The Department of Justice brought suits to protect the civil rights of African Americans and hold accountable those who were violating those rights. Then almost a century later, during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, it was Department of Justice lawyers who brought actions to protect the civil rights again, of African Americans and protect their right to vote, to go to school, and to travel. So to meet the urgent needs of this moment, when I became U.S. Attorney approximately 2 years ago, one of the first things I did was to create a civil rights division. And we work very closely, as the Attorney General said, and they are very good partners with us. We work very closely and work our Civil Rights Division, which brings together in one place lawyers whose exclusive focus is on protecting the civil rights of those folks in New Jersey, from Jewish communities, Muslim communities, and every potentially marginalized community. As some of you know, and as the Attorney General referenced, my office brought criminal charges about a year ago against the defendant who we alleged attempted to firebomb this very synagogue. And we have not hesitated to bring hate crime charges when the evidence warrants it. Now, one of the issues that we all grapple with today, and it relates directly to the issue in schools, is the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is, of course, an issue that protects speech in America. And the speech that it protects is speech that can be hurtful and offensive and bigoted. But we're able to prosecute hate crimes when hateful speech is accompanied by violence or acts of violence. But when it's not an actionable hate crime, we may be able, along with our state counterparts and also the federal Department of Education, to bring an action relating to discriminatory harassment when there is severe and pervasive conduct in schools, for example, that denies students their right to education. So one of the things you're going to hear about tonight is that notwithstanding the First Amendment, which is an important protection in America that protects us all, that schools do have an obligation to avoid harassment. And when there is discriminatory harassment, an obligation that they should be stopping the harassment, they should be condemning it, they should be making clear, either articulating or reaffirming an anti-discrimination, anti-harassment policy. They should articulate those guidelines. They should train teachers and staff to prevent and to report and how to address such issues. So these are really important issues. All of us in law enforcement have a number of tools at our disposal. The Department of Education Civil Rights Office has brought to date, since October 7th, 45 investigations of school districts across America. 3 of those investigations relate to New Jersey, Rutgers, the Teaneck High School, and the Newark public school system. So as the Attorney General said, and I reiterate, one of the most important measures and things for you to take away from tonight is report if you're aware of incidents. In schools or otherwise, it helps law enforcement do its job. A single incident alone may not be actionable, but the information coupled with other information that's gathered may end up being an important part of the puzzle in allowing law enforcement to do its job. So I thank you very much for inviting me here tonight. And I know my team here looks forward to a vibrant discussion with all of you and working together to help combat discrimination in our schools and in our state. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Emily Goldberg. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. I'm Emily Goldberg. I'm an assistant U.S. attorney in the Civil Rights Division. I work for Philip Sellinger, and I'm also a very proud Ner Tamid member, so it's really wonderful to be here tonight. And I also get to ask this esteemed panelists questions tonight. I'm going to start with, I guess this is an impromptu one, guys. I'm sorry, but perhaps you could very quickly explain the difference between the state attorney general and the U.S. side of things, because I think that's something that for non-lawyers isn't always clear.
Sure, I'm happy to start. First of all, thanks so much, everyone, for being here for this incredibly important and really timely discussion. We're fortunate in New Jersey, as we are across the country, to have the benefit of having multiple overlapping law enforcement agencies who are out here in the state to protect people's rights and people's civil rights. And I'll say on this front that my office, the Division on Civil Rights, sits within the Office of the Attorney General. Matt Placken's my boss. So he won't be grading me on my remarks tonight. But we work hand in glove with the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is a federal law enforcement agency in I can talk a little bit about that, but we're constantly coordinated on the work that we're doing, and that's so important, not just to ensure that there's coordination in our responses to the problems on the ground, but also because we often are learning from one another in, we're sharing information, we're talking in broad strokes about strategy so that we can take a coordinated approach to protecting people's rights here.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Mike Campion. I work at the U.S. Attorney's Office with Emily, and we, as Sundeep was saying, we do coordinate frequently, nearly every day, with our counterparts at the State Attorney General's office. So at the U.S. Attorney's Office, we are part of the U.S. Department of Justice. At the U.S. Department of Justice, we have both criminal and civil authority to protect civil rights. On the criminal side, we work with our federal partners at the FBI and our criminal hate crime investigations. And we also, on the civil side, work with the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights. And I just want to highlight my colleague here tonight, David Krieger from the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights. And we, as I note, we frequently work with their office, and they take administrative actions to protect students in schools from discriminatory harassment. So in terms of both criminal and civil enforcement, though, tonight our focus primarily is on harassment in schools and the actions that both our offices can take.
Thank you, Mike, also known as my boss.
Colleague, yeah.
The next question's for you, Rabbi. Oh, okay. I think the rabbi did already, but yeah. But you can feel free to re-identify yourself. Brandi Rubin of the...
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sundeep Iyer. I'm the director of the Division on Civil Rights here in New Jersey.
Mike Campion, Chief of the Civil Rights Division. And I'll also note, I'm really happy to say I'm a resident of Essex County. My kids are in the South Orange and Maplewood school system. I see some friends here tonight. And so these issues really hit home. They hit home, I mean, on both a personal and professional level.
Thank you. Okay, Rabbi. What are you seeing in this community in terms of anti-Semitism, particularly in the schools? And have things changed since October 7th?
So anti-Semitism comes in a lot of different forms. It comes both kind of on the political right and the political left. And at different points over the past few years, the Jewish community has been worried in different ways about each of those different forms. Right? When you think of anti-Semitism on the right, you often think about white supremacy. You think about the swastika that's painted on the local playground, which there have been, or that's been etched into the desk at schools, which there has been, or the student who is called, a name because they're Jewish. And the truth is that is very pervasive, right? When someone throws a Molotov cocktail at the congregation, in part likely because they grew to hate Jews because of YouTube videos that they had watched and things like that, you find that kind of anti-Semitism is there. Since October 7th, there's been a rise in a different kind of anti-Semitism, which has been anti-Semitism more on the political left, which is anti-Jewish sentiment couched in anti-Israel sentiment. Now, it is very possible to be critical of Israel. In fact, I'm often critical of Israel, and many Israelis that I respect also are, right? One of the greatest protest movements of this century happened this past summer, where hundreds of thousands of Israelis marched against the Israeli government because of efforts by the Israeli government to lessen the power of the judiciary, which could have real impact on democracy in Israel. But there are definitely times where criticism of Israel crosses over. When, for example, the lines are blurred between Jew and Israeli, or between the Israeli government and the average Israeli. when things are leveled against Israel that are unfair, right? Words like apartheid, words like genocide, those types of things. When Israelis and Jews are compared to Nazis. And what we find is that in talking with students, not only are the rare cases out there that are often scary, you know, the swastikas painted on the playgrounds and things like that, but also the things shown on social media, the conversations that happen in the hallway, the jabs that teachers have made. And what we've found is that more and more students are fielding conversations around that. Now, there are occasionally, you know, taunts made on the playground and things like that, that parents come to me and that they're looking for what to do. And sometimes there's not much to do. A kid comparing Christmas and Hanukkah, of course there's an educational opportunity, go to the teacher, talk about it. But there are times where, you know, the comments are a little more insidious than that. And so parents are often wondering, you know, what can we actually do about that? And the point of tonight is to try to figure out that, to try to learn what the tools are at one's disposal when someone does say something that is incredibly troubling.
Thank you. And I think we're going to do a quick question to Brandi first. We've obviously just heard what the concerns of this community are. Is that borne out in the data that you're seeing?
Yes, it really is. And I just want to start by also defining anti-Semitism, just on a very simple definition, because there's a lot of definitions out there, but we can just think of it as hostile behaviors or belief towards someone who is Jewish just because they are Jewish. So post-October 7th, we have seen really a tsunami of anti-Semitism. Is it just because of the conflict in the Middle East? I think there's a bit more to it. Going back to a study that ADL has done since 1964, looking at anti-Semitic attitudes in America and looking at 11 classic anti-Semitic tropes like power and greed and disloyalty and deicide and blood libel and Holocaust denial. In 2022, the results were shocking. 85% of Americans believed at least one of these anti-Semitic tropes. 20% of Americans believed 6 or more of these tropes. And 3% of Americans believed all 11 of these tropes, which is more people than there are Jews in America. So when you think about it from that perspective, what we're seeing post-October 7th is not as surprising, but the numbers are still shocking. So coincidentally, ADL released its data yesterday morning, and since October 7th, in the past 3 months, there have been 3,283 anti-Semitic incidents documented, which is a 361% increase over the same period last year. But perhaps more terrifying, that's more than ADL usually documents in an entire year. The only year we had a number higher than that was in 2022, which were record highs. So in the last 3 months, we're seeing more anti-Semitic incidents you would normally see in an entire year. These incidents are assaults, vandalism, verbal and written harassment, and rallies that include some sort of anti-Semitic rhetoric or support for terrorism against Israel. And when you're looking at schools, there have been 246 incidents in K through 12 schools in the last 3 months, and on college campuses, 505. And in all of 2022, there were only 219 recorded incidents on college campuses, but 505 in just the last month. So the rabbi talked about what some of that stuff looks like. You know, what do we see? It can be anything from a group chat saying, you know, Hitler was right. It can be graffiti in the bathroom saying, kill the Jews. It can be, you know, parking tickets being passed out saying, gas the Jews. It can be a girls' basketball game which just had to be canceled in Yonkers last week because of anti-Semitic slurs being hurled at the opposing team. So unfortunately, the data is not looking good. It wasn't good before October 7th. It's terrifying in the last 3 months. And I think, you know, Sundeep is probably seeing similar at the state level and maybe, bias incidents as well, not just anti-Semitism. So I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, unfortunately, the numbers that we track in New Jersey very much align with what ADL is seeing nationally. Just to step back a little bit for context, even before October 7th, we've seen the number of bias incidents recorded in New Jersey. Bias incidents are what we track in the Office of the Attorney General, quadruple in the 5 years between 2017 and 2022. 2022 was an all-time record for bias incidents. And fortunately, that was true across just about every protected group. But as Brandi said, what we've seen since October 7th has been even different in kind from that. We're still working on pulling apart all of the numbers that we've gotten over the last 3 months, but compared to the same period in 2022, our numbers are very similar to ADL. We're seeing a 3 to 4 times increase in the number of anti-Semitic bias incidents in the last 3 months of 2023 when you compare that to 2022. I think one other thing I want to highlight about the numbers that we're seeing, and this very much tracks with what Brandi just said. 2022 was the first time in New Jersey, we've been tracking bias incidents for 30 years now, since 1994. And 2022 was the first time in those 30 years where schools were the #1 site of bias incidents in our state. And all indications seem to be that that was true in 2023 as well. And I think we're really reaching this moment where so many of our students don't feel safe in school because of these numbers. And I should say, these numbers are just a reflection of what is reported to us. And I know Brandi agrees with this sentiment as well. We know that what gets reported to us is just a fraction of what happens every day, because as the Attorney General said before, we know that there's so many people who experience bias but don't report it to our office. And there are all kinds of reasons why people don't report. But we're tracking these enormous increases in bias, but that's just a small fraction of what's actually happening.
And I'll just add, I have not much to add to what Brandi and Sundeep are saying, but the federal numbers track as well that the incidents are increasing. They've been increasing over the past several years, but in particular since October 7th. And I know we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but one of the things we all want to urge everyone to do is to report bias incidents when they see them. And one of the things we have in the materials is we've prepared a one-sheeter that has where to report both federal and the state. And we have another sheet for reporting to the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights. So we encourage you to distribute that, look at it, and report to all of us when you encounter bias incidents, particularly in school.
Thank you very much. And I just want to point to the table over here, which has all the materials that Mike just referenced, as well as materials from ADL. I'm going to switch gears, and we're going to try to dig into the law a bit now. When we hear things like swastikas in the schools, people saying gas the Jews, kill the Jews, this is very hard for us to hear. And I think for people who aren't lawyers, it can be very difficult to understand why criminal prosecutions don't happen when such horrible things are said. So Mike, I'm wondering if you can kick us off by explaining the difference between hate speech and hate crimes.
Sure. So in general, a hate crime or a federal hate crime is when there is a violent criminal offense, such as a murder, an assault, arson, that's motivated by one's hate against a group protected by law: race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin. And when there is a hate crime, that is an office that could, or that is a crime that could be prosecuted by my office and the New Jersey Office of Attorney General under state law. Some recent examples of hate crimes, some very sad and tragic examples, the supermarket in Buffalo, motivated by hate, the Tree of Life Synagogue, the Pulse nightclub. All of these are hate crimes. It's a crime, a violent crime motivated by hate. There's another federal hate crime is where someone intentionally defaces, damages, or destroys a house of worship or attempts to do so. So for example, someone tries to bomb a church, burn a synagogue, deface a mosque, all would also be a federal hate crime. But one thing I need to note is there's a very high bar for hate crime charges. In many instances, state criminal law or municipal offenses may apply more easily. It may be more appropriate to charge under state law than federal law, depending on the case. And our offices always coordinate this on trying to find the most appropriate way to prosecute an offense, whether federal or state, to be able to get the remedy that we're looking for.
Thank you. Mike, I'm just going to ask a quick follow-up. Can you explain when speech might cross the boundaries from protected to perhaps not protected speech?
Yeah, absolutely. And U.S. Attorney Selinger referenced this a little bit earlier. Hate speech is offensive. Hate speech is disturbing. Hate speech is repugnant. But hate speech, in many cases, is protected by the First Amendment. It's one of the prices we pay to live in a democracy. It's a cornerstone of our democracy, but it protects everyone's right to speak their mind, even when it is the most repugnant and upsetting and offensive speech. And we know this can be upsetting. So I'll provide an example of what may be hate speech and when it may begin to cross the line to something that could be actionable. So maybe a speaker at a rally says, we need to take a stand and destroy those who stand in our way, from the river to the sea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In many cases, the law will allow this as hate speech, protected First Amendment rights. Well, but the word destroy was in there. Well, destroy could have a lot of meanings. It could refer to political or social action and not necessarily specify violence. So without more details, this would likely not be a prosecutorial, I'm stumbling on my words, prosecutorial violation. Some speech is not protected speech. There is a limit to free speech protections. So let's go back to the same rally. Another speaker may say, global intifada, Jews like them standing over there, we are going to kill you. And maybe they even pick up a rifle and point. All of the details there would indicate that that is a violent action, what is called under the law a true threat. And if it's a true threat, it is not protected speech, and that is something that could be prosecuted as a federal hate crime.
Thank you, Mike. That's very helpful. Sundeep, I'm going to ask you this question. In the schools context, when we have what would be considered hate speech and not something that could be criminally prosecuted, what protections do children have under the state law?
So this is a really important point. Everything Mike said about the First Amendment is exactly right. It provides really broad protection. But even speech that is protected, kind of depending on where it's uttered, might nonetheless trigger obligations on the part of the school if it happens in the school environment. And in my mind, if you take nothing else away today, it's the most important point to my mind in this moment is that the First Amendment doesn't mean that educational institutions have to stand to the side and let people say things that create a hostile environment. And under our law, the New Jersey Law Against Discrimination, which is one of the nation's oldest and strongest civil rights statutes, is also true under federal law, and Mike will talk a little bit about this. Speech that creates a hostile environment, particularly where the school knows about it, should have known about it, creates an obligation on the part of the school to take corrective action. So school has an obligation to remediate in those cases. Now, what that looks like depends on the particular case. And at least under our law, it's not like the law against discrimination says, okay, schools have to do X, Y, and Z in every case. It does very much depend on what the particular facts are, and that makes sense. I mean, you need, if you have an obligation to remediate, that obligation obviously turns on the thing that you are remediating in the first place. But the remedial action that the school is taking has to be not just enough to stop the misconduct, but also under our law to prevent reasonably prevent the misconduct from recurring. And so, schools have obligations, I think, in many of these cases, to make a clear statement after a bias incident occurs, after there's bias-based harassment that denounces bias-based conduct. I think that is one of the most critical things that any school district can do in this moment, is to make clear to people where they stand and to make clear that bias won't be tolerated on the school campus. I think once again that the big takeaway that all of us should remember in this moment is that even though the First Amendment provides broad protection for speech, doesn't mean schools are powerless. Schools really do have an obligation to remediate a hostile environment that's created by speech.
Thank you so much. Mike, is there anything you'd like to add in terms of federal law?
Sure. So federal law is very similar to state law here. We enforce the Civil Rights Act. And we specifically enforce Titles 4 and 6 of the Civil Rights Act. And under Title 4 of the Civil Rights Act, we are able to address discriminatory harassment in school based on religion, among other protected categories. And so, as Sundeep was noting, this is an area where speech may cross the line into something that's actionable. So if there is harassment that targets Jewish students based on the religion, or any student based on the religion, this could be verbal abuse, name calling, epithets, slurs, graphic or written statements or symbols, even physical assault, or other threatening or harmful or humiliating conduct. The law requires the school district to have an adequate response to those bias incidents. It's the same under state and federal law. So schools would violate the law when an incident occurs if the harassment is severe, pervasive, or persistent. The district knew or should have known about the severe, pervasive, or persistent harassment and failed to take appropriate steps to remedy the harassment. I'll also note one other area where the law would require or would be a violation of the law if the school uses a disparate application of disciplinary rules. So for example, if one religious group, the students of the religious group, are subjected to more severe discipline than another religious group, that would also be a violation of federal civil rights law. And one thing I want to note here is, again, my friend and colleague David Krieger is here from the, why don't you stand up, David, just so everyone sees you? Yeah. It's from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights. They enforce Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. They have a much larger docket of cases around the country and around the state focused on this type of discriminatory harassment. We at the Department of Justice, we do focus in this area. We coordinate with our federal and state partners. In our office, we typically focus on what's known as a pattern of practice. We track schools around the state, and when we see a pattern of practice, not just one incident, or not just one incident of severe or pervasive harassment, but where it is really becoming particularly problematic when the school is an area where it's more likely that the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice would get involved.
Thank you very much. I think this is one of the more important questions I'm about to ask, and I'll say that the first conversation I ever had with Brandi Rubin when we first met came up was an incident that occurred at my son's school. And I was relating it to her, and she said, well, did you report it to the ADL? And I said, no, I didn't. I didn't really think about doing that, which I felt particularly stupid saying in that I was just meeting Brandi for the first time. But I now fully appreciate why reporting is so important after incidents happen. So I'd like to ask you, Brandi, can you explain why you think it's so important to report incidents to the ADL?
So Emily was speaking to me in a professional capacity, and that's when we were chatting about her situation. So when incidents are reported to ADL, we work closely with each individual constituent for their particular situation. And we help understand what's going on, and we see how we can help address the situation for each individual person. Also, if constituents would like something to remain anonymous, we can usually work with that as well. And it really depends on the situation. So for example, if it's a legal action involving campus, we have a call center, we can refer you to lawyers. If there's a situation involving vandalism, harassment in the community, we can liaise with law enforcement and follow up with law enforcement or the local federation and their community security director. If it's a situation involving online harassment, we have a Center for Technology and Society that can actually work with the online platforms to help resolve the situation online. If there's a particular person or group that is harassing or doing vandalism, we have a Center on Extremism that can actually dig deep and look into a particular person or group. And when it comes to school incidents, I mean, I know a lot of people in the audience here tonight from, being on the phone or on Zoom with principals, educators, DEI officers, because when an incident happens, we work directly with the school. I speak to principals and superintendents regularly, trying to help resolve the specific incident that occurred, but also help bring peace to the community and help figure out how we can help the community heal and support the student or group that was affected. So there's really many different aspects to our work because again, it depends on the particular incident, but just reporting to us, you will get a phone call back or an email back to set up a phone call to find out the situation, find out what happened. And in many instances, we work directly with my partners here at the Division on Civil Rights and the U.S. Attorney's Office, local clergy, we work with AJC, we work with Federation. It's all about, a full holistic approach to figure out how we can help the person who was affected by this anti-Semitic incident.
Thank you, Brandi. I'm going to go in order of the seating instead of the planned order. Sundeep, can you talk a little bit about reporting to your agency and perhaps also comment on why it's so important that families report from a legal perspective?
So, as the Attorney General mentioned earlier, we have the benefit here in New Jersey, and it's actually quite unique among states, of having a single unified reporting system, reporting structure for bias incidents, which is to say, regardless of whether you report your incident to your local police department, to your county prosecutor's office, to the Division on Criminal Justice's Bias Crime Unit, or online at bias.njcivilrights.gov, all of those bias incident reports get funneled to the same place. They end up on my desk. They end up on the Attorney General's desk. There is actually a large team in the Office of the Attorney General that reviews every single one of these every day. And I'll just say reporting is so important, not just because it allows us in situations where there's a bias crime or where, for example, an incident occurs in school, for us to take enforcement action, whether that's civil action or criminal action, but also because it really helps us understand exactly what is happening in communities across the state. So that when we're thinking about how do we plan our outreach, and I just have to say as a side note, our Associate Director at the Division on Civil Rights for Policy Outreach and Community Relations, Trish Perlmutter, is here, has been leading a lot of our outreach work across the state, also happens to be a member of this congregation. but having that information is really important for us as a state in thinking about how we do our outreach, which schools we engage with, to try and address issues, not just reactively, but also to be more proactive in the approach we take.
Thank you so much. And I guess it goes without saying, and I'll say this because I think it's an important point. We have representatives from a number of the school districts here, and they're not the enemy, right? Like, we want to believe very strongly that we're working together toward the same goals, and I believe that as panelists, that is our goal as well. They cannot help your kids if they don't know about the incident. So I think that just practically speaking, if we're all going to work together and expect the districts to work with us, it behooves us to be very transparent about what's going on. Sorry, that's my editorialization. Mike, is there anything about reporting that you'd like to add from the federal law perspective?
I'll just emphasize again, it's important to report. I'm grateful to our state partners. They do share the reporting information and ends up on my desk as well. But I'll note, report often. There are multiple agencies. It doesn't hurt to report to multiple agencies. That way it helps ensure that the right eyeballs get on it. We all take it very seriously, but report. It may not always be clear who to report to. Just report. It may not always be clear if there's a violation. Let us figure that out. Just report it if there's a bias incident.
Thank you. Brandi, I'm going to ask you one follow-up question. Do you have any advice to families about what kind of information they should pull together in order to report something? Maybe I'll be more specific.
Yeah,
Should families feel any pressure to have some sort of legal case built, or can they just come to?
Okay, yeah,
sure.
no, not at all, because we can help you with that. So just file it. The incident report that you file can have very minimal information. Especially, sometimes I find that parents are nervous about putting too much if it is a school situation involving their child, and then someone will call you. If it's in New Jersey, it'll probably be me, and if it's a school incident, and I'll help you flesh out the story and help flesh out what happened and figure out what is the approach that you want to be taking. In some instances, parents say, "Can you call my rabbi? I don't want you to call the principal. Actually, I'm not ready for that yet. Can you talk to my rabbi and find out more about whether he's hearing things from other community members? Is it just my kid?" Other times it's, no, I want you to be, the person calling the principal for me and, taking the first step and doing outreach to the school. I do often say to parents, does the school even know? Because if the school doesn't know, they can't address the situation. So that is also, oftentimes the first step is making sure the school is even aware of it, because obviously they can't do anything if they don't know about it.
Thank you. Mike, I think had something to add.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, when you do report, or around the time you report, if you can, it helps us, the more evidence you can provide, if you could report in writing, if you have any other type of evidence that supports what you're seeing, it really helps us quite a bit. So more than just a phone call, more than just an email, include any evidence, documents, and photographs.
Thank you. Rabbi, can you talk a bit about what role local clergy can play when a family needs to discuss something that's happened in the schools?
Absolutely. So one of the questions that you should always ask yourself when an incident happens is, what are my tools and who are the players that I need to bring into the conversation? And there are definitely going to be times, first of all, you should always tell us, your clergy, what's going on, in part because we're also kind of collecting data too. And so even if in the process of talking, we decide that using us, to come to a meeting with the superintendent or with the principal, or, or having us, show up at a meeting to speak, if it's a public meeting, is not on the cards for you, though know that these are all tools in your toolbox. It helps us to understand so that when, for example, Brandi does call and say, what's going on locally, I can say, I've had a number of parents come to me about this particular kind of behavior that's happening in the school. So that's really good. And no, by the way, the clergy all talk to one another about this kind of stuff too. The other thing to understand is also we have relationships that you may not have. So for example, we may have members in our congregation who are on the school boards, right? Or we've dealt with something similar with the school districts only last year. And therefore, there's A, some institutional memory, and B, some pre-existing relationships that are built up. But the other thing that I'm gonna say, which is really important to hear, is that when something happens to your child, your emotional temperature is really, really high. And it's really good to have somebody who it's not their kid that's happening to, who is your ally, that can help you to figure something out. I was recently talking to a parent where their child came home and said, you know, a teacher said this thing in school. And when they were ready to kind of go to the principal and go to the administration and do something about it, my first question was, have you actually approached the teacher about this yet? And when they actually did, they realized the child just completely misunderstood a point that the teacher was making. And it was a learning experience for the teacher, and it was a learning experience for the student. And so there are a lot of avenues before actually going and needing to, let's say, fight. But in this day and age, we often come forward kind of with our fisticuffs ready. And so to be able to have some people in your life that you trust, that you can rely on, who can ask you the probing questions also, so that you can figure out, you know, what are the next steps in this, I think is really helpful in terms of giving people benefit of the doubt as well.
Thank you. Sundeep, this is obviously another very important question. When a family does come forward and report an incident, what are the school's responsibilities at that point?
So a couple things on this front. First, here in New Jersey, we have an anti-bullying Bill of Rights. It's state law. It's enforced by our state Department of Education. But that law imposes a number of obligations on the school district when they become aware of a bias incident. And under the law, the threshold for triggering that set of responses is not that the school district needs to know that there was some kind of criminal violation. All they need to know is that there was some action that was taken that is based on someone's protected characteristic, whether it's their race, religion, gender, and it's action that has created a hostile environment for the student, or had the potential to create a hostile environment, or create feelings of unsafety among students. And this is, of course, a matter of interpretation for each school district. But once the school district has determined that the particular incident crosses that threshold, there's a whole set of obligations that kick in. The teacher, for example, who became aware, has to report up to the principal. Usually it's within a day or two. The school district may have an obligation at that point to report out to law enforcement. The school district has an obligation to notify the parent or guardian of both the student who may have been the aggressor in the situation, and the student who was on the receiving end. And there's also a set of requirements with respect to the investigation of that incident as well. So the school district has to start the investigation within a day of receiving the report, and has 10 days to wrap up the investigation. So it's a really short timeline. But I think beyond the law, there's also a set of best practices that schools really should be thinking about and following. Our division, in partnership with the Department of Education, has issued guidance both for K through 12 schools and colleges and universities on how to prevent, respond to, and ultimately intervene in bias incidents while they're occurring. And there's a lot of really useful information in that. And I always encourage school administrators, parents, to read that resource. It's short, it's 3 pages, and it's a bullet point checklist of things that the school should be considering, that parents in the community should be considering. But a couple of points I want to highlight from that. First is the importance of the school having a clear plan in place for how they're going to deal with bias incidents. And I think that's so important because time is very much of the essence when a bias incident happens in school. If a bias incident happens and you're scrambling for a playbook, you're not going to be able to respond as quickly as you need to be. And this dovetails with the other major point I want to make here, which is one I made before. But schools, I think, sometimes feel like, and I'm a lawyer, I understand this feeling. They sometimes feel like, well, there are confidentiality concerns, there are a whole host of legal concerns related to disclosing information to the school community while an investigation is ongoing. But the reality on the ground is that you're not going to prevent people from talking about this incident because students will talk amongst themselves, parents will talk amongst themselves, and the absence of a statement from the school district, a clear statement denouncing bias-based conduct, even if that statement acknowledges that there is an investigation that's ongoing, but that makes clear that there's no place for hate, there's no place for bias-based conduct in the school district. The absence of that statement sends, I think, a really strong signal, and it makes students feel less safe. It makes parents and guardians feel like the school isn't looking out for them. And so we always strongly encourage school districts to ensure that they're out there communicating with the school community as quickly as they can, because time really is of the essence when a bias incident happens.
I just want to add, Emily, we're also available to help support schools if schools need advice in sending out a communication. But I can't, agree with you more. When an incident happens, a communication needs to go out, calling out the incident for what it is. So if it's a noose in the bathroom, it's a racist incident. If it's a swastika in the bathroom, it's an anti-Semitic incident. It needs to be called out immediately for what it is, and it needs to be condemned. And again, we're all resources for schools and are available to help if there's a question, if a school needs some sort of advice, wants to read a statement to us before sending it out, we are also available to do that and provide that resource.
Can I make just one other point? I think sometimes schools feel like it's an admission of failure on their part when a bias incident happens in their school. And I think the reality of this moment is that bias is sometimes gonna happen in schools, and the real question, the real test for the school is not gonna be, that test is not gonna be aced by sweeping the bias incident under the rug. It's all about how the school district responds. To my mind, if a school district is reporting 0 bias incidents in this moment, that's in itself a potentially troubling sign, because it might mean that, it might mean that there's no bias in the school, but it also might mean that when people are reporting incidents, they're getting swept under the rug. And so having bias incidents happen in your school is not in and of itself an admission of failure on the part of the school. It's very much about how the school responds.
I was gonna say, we also have schools who regularly self-report to us, and it makes parents feel so much better when they report to ADL. And I say, oh, I already know about that because your principal has reported it directly to us. So we do have schools and principals who do that. It's not any pox on a school that they're having incidents. Exactly as Sundeep said, it's about how you're responding to the incidents and educating the community in response to those incidents.
Yeah, and I'll just add, as Sundeep and Brandi are noting, a school should not just sweep it under the rug, but they should also properly label it. And I think they're both saying this. But it's not just bullying; it's anti-Semitic conduct, or it's racist conduct, or it's anti-Islamic conduct. It has to be properly labeled and properly addressed. And a school can't just point to, well, we had a program on the Holocaust, we're addressing it. That type of welcome. You should have programs like that, but that is not enough to address the to address the moment. And also it's important to keep in touch with the targeted students to provide appropriate outreach to parents and community groups about what's happening and with the goal of preventing future incidents.
Thank you. I know we're trying to make this a bit more of a speed round as we get to the end, but Mike, can you give just a very quick reflection on some of the settlements that you've seen on the federal side that have identified some of the mitigation approaches that schools should be taking?
Sure. So, our settlements kind of reflect everything that Sundeep and Brandi are saying now. In the settlement, I think I lost the microphone. Oh, there we go. In the settlements, we often require the school to implement an anti-harassment policy or reaffirm an existing policy. Like I just noted, publicly label the conduct as what it is, whether it's anti-Semitic, racist, anti-Islamic, homophobic. Counsel the harassers about the harmful effects of their conduct, implement a system to ensure that incidents are reported and investigated, designate an anti-bias point of contact in the school who's trained on the obligations, train the staff to recognize, prevent, respond to harassment, create an age-appropriate curriculum to educate students about the history and dangers of anti-Semitism, and as I noted earlier, conduct outreach to parents and community groups.
Thank you. This is the last question, then we're going to get to Q&A, and I'm going to start with you, Sundeep. Can you give us a sense of maybe one non-legal tool that you see as an important way of addressing anti-Semitism?
I think proactive education is really critical. And there's one piece of education I want to highlight, which is skills-based and is something that everyone here can avail themselves of. So at the Division on Civil Rights, we have an education and training unit that does long-form trainings for members of the public on a whole variety of anti-bias topics. But one of the most important topics that we're training on right now is providing people with strategies for effective bystander intervention. So you can be an upstander and not just a bystander. And the reason I pull that out is because I think effectively intervening when bias is happening, when you see it, is not just something that people can do innately. It's a skill. There's a series of techniques that you can use, techniques that you can practice. And I think about it a little bit like a muscle that you kind of need to work it out in order to get better at it, because intervening when bias is happening around you is an uncomfortable thing. It's an uncomfortable thing for so many of us to have that conversation with someone who may be saying something, whether it's an off-color remark or something that is motivated by an anti-Semitic trope. That's an uncomfortable conversation, but it's so important to have the right techniques, the right strategies for that conversation. And so, our division offers trainings on those strategies, and I think that kind of education work is really, really important in this moment.
Mike, do you have anything to add?
I'll echo Sundeep. So it's so important to speak up. So one of the things that the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice is doing is, apart from our enforcement work, is we've launched a program, United Against Hate. Our state partners have similar programs, and we collaborate in each other's programs. But one of the focuses of the programs is kind of doing what we're doing tonight to identify the laws we enforce and encourage people to report. But it's also to help build alliances against hate, to speak up when you see bias and hate. And it's so interesting hearing Sundeep talking about this. I was on a call earlier today with someone who heads a mosque in Western Morris County. And he was talking to me about how there's been very public attacks on someone associated with his mosque. very vitriolic attacks based on his religion as a Muslim. And what he told me, which was really so encouraging and not surprising, the ADL came out and defended the colleague. I don't want to get into the specifics. Sent a letter. So this is part of the alliances against hate that we're all seeking to build together. And one of the things that, you know, I get so depressed seeing the reports of bias and hate. But one of the things that just so encourages me is coming out to events like tonight, to hearing people across different communities come together to defend each other. And there's so much more of that than there is of the hate we're seeing. And so I just wanted to leave that thought.
Thank you. And Brandi, can you add anything that you feel would be a good non-legal tool for people to keep in mind?
Sure. I want to encourage everyone really to be active participants in society. You know, being upstanders, but also, you know, in New Jersey where we have all of these small towns, to get involved, vote in your local elections, help candidates for, you know, run for school board, and really be active participants in our democracy. But going back to our schools, we're here to support, we're all here to support your schools. We're all here to support your communities, and we need the schools to be a partner with us. So I think hopefully what everyone will get out of this evening, we'll have Q&A momentarily, but that we're all here to collaborate with each other and be partners and help build stronger communities together.
Thank you. And Rabbi, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, what I would just say is that learn as much about the process and learn as much about the players in your schools as possible before anything actually happens. Because once things happen, the timing is really short and it feels very raw. And so, you know, the HIB process, which is the process of kind of investigating and figuring out what happened and how to respond to it, can feel like a quagmire when you're in it. It's hard to understand. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it, and I've experienced it as other families have gone through it as well. The more you understand about it, the more you're able to kind of have patience with it, because it does take a while sometimes, and the more that you're able to then ask the right kind of questions when it actually goes forward. Same, by the way, with the people in your school. You should have a sense, who are the Jewish faculty in your child's school? A great piece of advice I once got actually from someone who deals in colleges and is talking about anti-Semitism on the college campus, but I imagine the high school is the same way, is that if there's an incident on the college campus, the administration doesn't necessarily want to hear from the parents. They want to hear a little more from the Hillel director, but actually the most powerful Jewish voice on a college campus is actually Jewish studies faculty, because faculty have a really important place within the college campus, and actually their voice matters a lot to the administration. And so try to understand, like, who are the Jewish faculty that could be allies in your child's public school? You know, what are the rabbinic voices that are understood? A parent voice is very important, and the younger your child gets, the more important your parent's voice is. But there are other allies to call on, and the more that you know who those voices are, and the more you develop a relationship with them before it gets real or raw, the more likely they are to be able to jump in to help you.
Okay, thank you so much. Unless anyone else has anything to add, I think we're going to try to have some Q&A. And I'm going to come around and bring the microphone, I think is the plan, to anyone that has a question. Okay. And I'm going to help direct who the question should go to.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. When a the anti-bias staff member in the school is publicly biased to an extreme, how do you handle that situation?
Sundeep or Mike?
Well, the first thing I would say is file a report of discrimination, particularly when you're dealing with potential bias in a process that's designed to ferret out bias. I think you can't expect that process to function the way it's intended to function. So the first thing I would say is report up to us at the Division on Civil Rights, to U.S. Attorney's Office, to the Department of Education. Any of those provide important pathways. I mean, at the Division on Civil Rights, we investigate every complaint that we get. In the last 3 months, you might imagine we've gotten a lot of complaints, including related to school issues, and we take a look at every single one. We conduct interviews, we conduct an investigation, and so you can file a report by going to bias.njcivilrights.gov.
Thank you. I'm going to come around to the front. Here you go, Lori.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Really, really appreciate it. And it's nice to see all these different divisions and what you guys do and how you collaborate. My question is, tonight we focused a lot on what to do after there is an incident. And all of you had touched upon the fact that there's been a real increase even October 7th, particularly in schools. And I'm wondering if there's information or data or research coming out of your offices or ADL or Department of Education on why it's particularly rising in schools. There's a lot of different things out there in the media, funding of different initiatives. There's some conversations about the very initiatives that are supposed to be creating more tolerant behavior. I agree with whoever said earlier, I don't like the word tolerant, welcoming. Actually doing quite the opposite. I've seen it for myself at a local school where, for example, there was an event designed only for students of a particular background. And at a young age, kids saying, well, I didn't even think they were different, because kids don't see difference until you show them that there's a difference. And the intention was, let's create a safe place for a group of people who historically have been marginalized. I completely sympathize with that intent, but I think the outcome was exacerbating this concept of everybody is different, especially at such a vulnerable time for kids when they're first sort of navigating these complex issues. So I know you guys are more on the legal side, it's a little different, but hopefully we could do a panel one time on causes. But I'm just curious if there's any data around that.
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of causes, there are a few things that we point to. There's the growth of hate in online spaces. There's the polarization of society and politics. There's the general emboldening of extremists that we've seen, and all of these various, situations all point towards increase in bias incidents. But we could have an entire panel on what kids are seeing in online spaces, and it's truly terrifying. Gaming, kids being harassed in online gaming spaces, what kids are seeing on TikTok, does unfortunately come into the classroom. So it's not just, it used to be, well, kids are only here, if kids are hearing something at home, that's why they're bringing it into school. Now it's what kids are seeing on their phone is what's coming into the classroom and into school.
I'd also add too that, because you asked a really provocative question, which is why schools are so much worse, right? I think there are two answers to that. The first answer to that is, I imagine that schools are reported at a high rate. I don't know this for a fact, but if it finds its way to a parent will usually do something about it. Whereas if something happens to an adult, often between two adults, they'll write it off and they won't report it in the same way. The other thing also is that kids are trying to push boundaries, and often hatred is a boundary that they're pushing in the same way they're experimenting with drugs or sex or any of the things that you find that kids are pushing boundaries on. And so part of education, both from a parental point of view, but hopefully from a school point of view, is to talk about those boundaries and to understand that, often a kid is saying something because they're trying to see what will happen if I say it, more than they are parroting an ideology that they're holding deeply. Sometimes that is the case, but sometimes kids don't totally understand what they're saying. They're doing it because they're trying to push that boundary. And so to educate around, we get that you want to be provocative. This is not a way to be provocative, is also, I think, a really important proactive step that one can use to stop hatred in schools.
Thank you. Other questions? I'm gonna try to get to everybody. I saw you next.
Thank you. You spoke a lot about statements that schools need to make, both from a legal obligation and from a moral obligation as well. Unfortunately, when I heard that, it's something that would happen after the incident. And so incidents could repeatedly happen. Schools could repeatedly issue statements denouncing this bias, but it doesn't do anything to prevent it from happening in the future, particularly if these incidents remain anonymous, if we can't figure out who the harasser is. And so, in our district, we've had repeated incidents, repeated statements. At what point is there an obligation of the school to do something beyond just issuing a statement and having some preventative measure?
Well, obligation aside, schools should be thinking first about prevention. And there are a lot of things that schools can do to effectuate a prevention mindset rather than just a responsive mindset. One of the 3 pages of our guidance for K through 12 schools is all about steps that schools can and should be taking to prevent. A couple of things I would lift up there. One is conducting things like school climate studies, evaluating, and Mike referenced this earlier, evaluating your school's disciplinary practices to see whether there are potential disparities in your disciplinary practices across protected categories. Having attempts at social media literacy training and education. And, I think this dovetails with what Brandi was talking about. A big part of the rise in schools, I think, has something to do with social media. And so, I think schools can be an important part of that. But there has to be a prevention mindset. I completely agree with you. It's not enough to issue a statement. I think in a lot of cases, that's frankly the bare minimum that the school should be doing. I think in some instances, schools aren't even doing that. But you have to take a prevention mindset to this. Otherwise, you're certainly not going to enforce your way out of this problem.
Yeah, and if the harassment is continuing, that's just more evidence that there hasn't been adequate steps taken.
Thank you.
And each school has to assess their particular climate and figure out what education tools they should be bringing in. Is it professional development for teachers? Is it education for kids? There has to be an assessment for each school is different. The demographics are different, whether it's elementary or middle school. What is the population of the school? But if there's an ongoing pattern of incidents in the school, then clearly education is needed to address the climate.
Thank you.
My question is about reporting. So I've always been told to report things to the school. So my question is, if something has been reported to the school, how likely is it that it gets funneled up to, to everybody up there?
How likely is it? So I think when something gets reported to the school is making a determination about whether it meets that threshold that I had talked about earlier, about whether it rises to the level of an HIV incident that requires reporting. Once they make that determination, they have an obligation to report. We don't have statistics on who is reporting all of the HIV incidents and who isn't, in part because it's hard to determine, to kind of prove the negative, to show that a school is getting all of these reports and not doing anything with them. We know that there are a lot of schools that do very regularly report, and they're required to report to law enforcement, and we see a lot of those reports. But we also know that that's not happening in every single school. And so there's definitely a need for more work, particularly in certain parts of the state, for us to get the message out to schools to make clear that you have a certain set of obligations. Once something clears that threshold as an HIV incident, you got to report it, and you got to report it to law enforcement. You got to report up to your principal. You got to report it to the parents. There's a whole set of obligations that schools have at that point. Yeah, I'm not aware of any state law requirement. There may be some schools that are collecting that data, but I'm not aware of any state law requirement to conduct, track all incidents that get reported.
I just want to add, though, when it comes to anti-Semitic incidents, please report to ADL, because data really drives policy, and anti-Semitic incidents, a school, if it's not going to end up, some schools do self-report to us, which is amazing, but not all do, and please just report to us so at least we have it for our data purposes.
So Rabbi tells me that we have time for one more question. That said, we're all going to stay afterward and answer as many questions informally as we can, so fear not.
Hi, this has been so informative, and I was curious as to whether there was outreach to local schools and administrators and principals and teachers to come to this event. And my second part to that question is, what kind of, is there outreach from your divisions to schools, on a regular basis? Has it heightened after October 7th so that schools, do know what to do in these scenarios?
So I'll just say something about the outreach. So we're actually really blessed to have members of the Montclair administration here. Dr. Pons, who is the superintendent. Also, there are representatives, I think, from Columbia High School here. Other school districts, I know Bloomfield. If you're from a school district, just raise your hand and say we're Westfield. Good. Wayne, MKA. So we're Maplewood. Thank you. So we're really blessed to have a lot of people from different school districts here. I will say, and I'm no expert in this, this is the second of these conversations that have happened. The first was in Bridgeport. I'm correct. Bridgewater. Thank you. Bridgewater. I had the wrong bridge, wrong state, I guess. Bridgewater, and so I imagine that this conversation is going to happen in other places.
We're going to be doing this conversation in Bergen County next week as well.
Just in terms of the outreach work that our division does, Mike talked a little bit about the U.S. Attorney's Office. We spend a lot of time, we have a community relations unit that spends a lot of time engaging with schools across the state, is developing programming for schools. We also have an education and training unit, as I mentioned earlier, that does trainings not just for members of the public, but also specifically for educators. We have one training, for example, on how to have anti-bias discussions in class, which again is another one of those trainings where we're trying to teach a set of skills for educators to be able to successfully facilitate some of these conversations.
And there's similar resources on the federal side. There's a federal community relations service at the Department of Justice that does something very similar to what the state does. And there are also the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention has a webinar series for schools geared towards these very issues.
So panelists,
Hi, again, I'm David Krieger. I'm a senior attorney with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. Just to make a quick plug, so my office has been rolling out, since October 7th, we have rolled out a new technical assistance presentation on Title VI and discrimination based on shared ancestry and ethnic characteristics, including against anti-Semitism. And my colleague and I presented it to ADL National virtual presentation twice with over 1,600 registrants. Out of the New York office, which covers New York and New Jersey, we happily would respond to what we would call reactive technical assistance. So if any of you, particularly federations, conglomeration of school districts, colleges and universities want us to come on site or virtually to present, I can give you an email address to make such a request. So it's Hannah, Hannah Zack, Z-A-C-K, @ed.gov. I'll also be here afterwards. If you have any questions, want to take my card, I can also facilitate such a request.
Thank you so much. Rabbi, do you want to say any last words?
Well, I want to say thank you to really to Brandi and to Emily. You were the brain people of tonight, and we're blessed that you decided to bring this conversation to us. And so thank you, and thank you to Sundeep. Thank you to Michael. And of course, thank you to Matt Platkin and Philip Sellinger, who had to run out for other obligations. But thank you for coming, and we're always here, all of us. So thank you.